Hey CodeCrew, in this lesson we're going to parse the JSON that we got from the YouTube API from the previous lesson. Now, I had originally intended to do that and more in this lesson, but it turned out that parsing JSON required some careful and deliberate explanations. So I want you to pay extra close attention in this lesson and re-watch the bits that you don't quite understand. The reason is because parsing JSON is such an integral part to building iOS apps, especially if you're going to be working with APIs in different platforms. All right, with that said, let's dive in. Just a quick note, if you're jumping into the series at this point, you kind of need to watch these lessons in a progression for it to make sense. First, make sure you've watched the 29 lesson beginner series to get the basic skills. Then make sure you're watching this YouTube app one day build lessons in order. Links to both of these playlists will be in the description. So let's start off where we last left off, and that was after downloading the data from the YouTube data API, and we got to this point. So we were successfully able to send a request with the API key and retrieve those playlist items. But now we have to parse the data into video objects, and that's what we're going to go through in this lesson. Now, before we begin, one quick thing I want to mention. At the end of the previous lesson, I forgot to check in our code into source control. Whenever possible, if you've finished a segment of functionality and it's working, you've tested it, it's a good idea to check it into GitHub or whatever source control you're using. That way, when you're moving on to the next thing and you maybe mess something up or you want to roll back, you don't have to roll back all the way back to the beginning. So that's what I did a couple of minutes before starting to record. And so I made this commit for our project in GitHub here. And also Bitrise picked it up and automatically then ran the code to double check that I didn't make any mistakes. So that's the great thing about having Bitrise hooked up to GitHub. And again, links to both GitHub and Bitrise are in the description below. Now, one quick thing I want to mention is that when you are checking in your code into a public repository like this one is, where everyone can access it, just be very careful about sensitive information like API keys and stuff like that. I initially accidentally checked in my API key, so then I removed it. But then the thing is, you can actually peek into your commit history and you can see, the code that was in previous commits and previous versions. So I basically had to regenerate my API key. So the one that you can see in here no longer works. All right, anyways, let's get back to the topic on hand today. And the first thing I want to do is really revisit that API call. I'm going to take the JSON response and I want to indicate to you and point out to you which pieces of information from that JSON we want to extract into our video object. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this JSON response. And if you're unsure about what this is, you should watch the previous video where we made this API call and got this JSON response containing the videos that we want. So I'm going to copy all of this because this window is kind of small to look at. And I'm going to go to a website like jsonlint.com, and this basically is a validator for JSON. Now, the JSON that comes back from the API call will definitely, or should be, valid. I would assume that it is. But the other nice thing is that we've got a nice big window to explore this JSON. So let's take a look at what this is, and especially if you don't know what JSON is, I'll just quickly go over what we're looking at here. So let me just sort of collapse as much as I can here. Actually, let me just collapse this root node. So you can see that everything is contained within these curly brackets here. And these two curly brackets indicates a JSON object. So this whole thing is a JSON object, the thing that gets returned. If you open up the JSON object, all it is, it's pairs of keys and values. So you can see here, kind is a key, and then there's a colon, and then on the other side of that colon is the value, right? So this is a key value pair. So the value is sort of like the data. The key is kind of like the label describing what the data is. So there's a key value pair, there's a key value pair, there's one. We don't really care about these key value pairs, which is why I'm skipping through it. But you can see here now that we have a key called items. And the value for items, well, it's actually an array, or in other words, a list of JSON objects, of other JSON objects. So you can see if I collapse these JSON objects, because remember, I told you that curly brackets indicates a JSON object. So items is a key And the value for items is actually a list of these 5 JSON objects. Now, each of these JSON objects, if I expand one of them, you can see it contains more key value pairs. And it's got kind, etag, ID. We get down to the snippet. That key, the value for that key is another JSON object. So you can see there's this nested effect sort of going on. All right, if I expand this JSON object, what's inside? Well, now we're starting to get to some of the data we're interested in for the video. We have this published date, right? The key is published at, the value is the date the video was published on. We have title, description, those are pretty self-explanatory. We have a key called thumbnails where the value is actually a JSON object. And that JSON object contains keys called default, medium, high, standard, and max res, basically describing what resolution of the thumbnail you want. So we're interested in the high key. That's what we need. If I expand this key, the value for the high key is another JSON object containing these key value pairs. And ultimately, this is what I'm interested in. The URL key and this value is the URL for our video thumbnail. Okay, so that's where we would get the thumbnail URL. Going on, we have this key value pair, this one, not really concerned about those. Check out this key, resource ID. The value for this key is a JSON object, which contains 2 key value pairs. We're interested in this key value pair. The key is video ID, and the value is the actual ID that we need to specify in the URL so that we can actually display the video. So we need that piece of data. So if you take a look at what we've got here in our Xcode project, we have a video struct. This is what we declared. And we have these properties, video ID, title, description, thumbnail, published. These are all the properties we need to set from the JSON data that I just pointed out to you right here. So if I collapse this again, each of these JSON objects under the items key, each of these JSON objects needs to be converted to a video object. So ultimately, when we parse this JSON response or translate this JSON, we are going to end up with a list of 5 video objects, right? We've got these 5 right here. Now, this process of translating this JSON into that list of video objects is called parsing JSON, or more specifically, decoding JSON into our video objects. Now, to make this process easier, Swift has something called the Codable Protocol, which basically allows us to specify instructions on how to translate this JSON into an array of these video objects. Now, the Codable Protocol is actually a combination of 2 protocols, encodable and decodable. It lets you specify instructions for translating both ways, decoding the JSON to the video object and also encoding a video object to the JSON format. Since we're only interested in decoding the JSON to a list of video objects, we're only going to use the Decodable Protocol instead of the 2-way Codable Protocol. But oftentimes when you look up how to parse JSON with Swift, they will call it the Codable Protocol, but that's really a 2-way street. So just to reiterate, we're only going to use the Decodable Protocol, and we're only going to specify the decoding instructions on how to map the JSON to properties of our video struct. Let's first start by indicating that our video struct is going to conform to the Decodable Protocol. And next, we're going to write the decoding instructions on how to map those JSON key value pairs into the properties that we have here. And that happens inside an initializer. And sometimes autocomplete will help you, and you'll see it on this list, and sometimes it won't. And you'll have to manually type it out. So I'm going to type it out here and then sort of explain to you what it does. So basically, there's a class called JSON decoder, and it takes the JSON data and you tell it what data type to try to decode that JSON into. In this case, we've indicated that our video object is decodable, and what that JSON decoder is going to do is pass one of these JSON objects here. that because there's 5. It's going to pass one of them into this initializer method, and in here you're going to write the instructions on how to turn this JSON object with all of these key value pairs and sort of map it into here. So that's basically the gist of what we're trying to do. Now there is one step before we can actually get to writing the instructions, and that is specifying the set of keys that we're interested in. And this set of keys has to exist in order for us to be able to parse that JSON object into a video object. So how we specify this is with a special enum that we can declare up here, and this is going to be called coding keys. And it's going to have a raw value type of string, and I'll explain to you what this means in a second when we get to it. And it also conforms to the coding key protocol. And again, I will point, when we get to where it matters, I will point out to you why we have to specify these two things. But in here, you start specifying the keys or indicating the keys that we're interested in. So you have a case for each key. So you start with a case, and then let's go and take a look at our JSON and see inside a single video JSON object, which key would we be interested in? Well, there is publish that, right? So what we indicate is the case name is our property name. We're going to do case published, and we say that is going to be equal to the key that should map to, the JSON key, and it has to be exactly matching with this JSON key name. So I'm going to copy this and I'm going to paste that there. All right, and then we just keep going like that. The next one, how about title? Title is equal to, and the JSON name for that would be title. Now, if it matches what we have up here, the property name, we don't really have to specify the string value for it, so we can just leave it like that. Case description. Again, the JSON key name for that is just description, so we don't have to specify a string. What else do we have here? Case thumbnail, and that is actually going to be the key for that. If we expand this, and you know, that is what we're ultimately trying to get to assign into our thumbnail property. So here we have to just specify the key for that value. So that is URL. Now these are the keys that have to exist in order for us to be able to get the data, right? Video ID. I think this matches too. So video ID was down here. And again, this video ID key matches our property name, so we don't have to specify this string. Okay, in addition to specifying these keys, the JSON keys that map to these properties, there are a couple of other keys that we're interested in, right? So if you take a look at this JSON object, right, this represents a video object, but all the keys that all the values that we're interested in are actually inside this JSON object, right, which is keyed by the snippet key. So we actually are interested in this snippet key as well. We need to reference this guy in order to fetch this JSON object that really contains all the data. So I'm going to also specify up here case snippet. And if you expand that JSON object, so there's publish that inside this title, description, okay, thumbnails, right? Ultimately, we want this key value pair, but this is actually contained as the JSON object for this key, right? And this JSON object is keyed by thumbnails. So we also have to specify this key and this key, right? Ultimately to reach this point, right? Because you need thumbnails to get this JSON object, and then in here you need to get to this key to get to this JSON object, and then ultimately that's how we get this key value pair. So thumbnails and high. So I'm going to put that here. Okay, and I think, oh, there's actually one more. So that was thumbnails. If you come down here, you'll notice that we need to access resource ID, right, to get to this JSON object, which ultimately contains the key value pair here that we're interested in. So resource ID is another key that we want to specify. So I'm going to put that there. And again, this will match that. All right, so now this part of our work is done. But I do want to mention that, you know how here we had to specify the JSON key name because it didn't match our property name up here? That is why we specified that the raw value for this enum for these cases is going to be string type. So that's an explanation of why, you know, we have to specify string here. And we will get to why this coding key part is necessary once we start writing the decoding instructions, which is exactly what we're going to do now. So what happens when this initializer is called? As I mentioned, this piece of JSON right here is going to get passed in to this initializer method. And this decoder parameter is a reference to that JSON decoder. So the first thing we need to do is get this information from the JSON decoder. Now in this whole decoding process, when we're writing these instructions on how to decode the JSON, a JSON object is known as a container. So this is a container, right? It's these curly brackets right here. This snippet key, right? The value is a JSON object here, which is known as a container. So this thumbnails key right here, the value is a JSON object, which is known as a container in the decoding process. So when you see the word container, you can kind of think of it as a JSON object. All right, so first we're going to get this container, right? This contains all the information. And the way we do that is we're going to say decoder dot container, right? And this throws. So if it can't retrieve it, if it can't return that data to us, it's going to throw an error. So that's what throws means. And we have to pass in the coding key protocol, which we've set up right up here. So what we do is we pass in coding keys dot self. And because this may throw an error, we actually have to write try here. So this is going to return that container. Why don't we assign it to a constant? So essentially what we've done here is we've gotten this container from the decoder, this guy right here, and we've assigned it to a constant called container. All right, what do we need to do next after we have this data? Well, we need to get this inner container, right, keyed by snippet, because that's really where all of our data is residing in. So we're going to say let snippet container equals, and we're going to sort of do the same thing that we have here, except this time we're not going to specify decoder, we're going to specify container, because container actually has all of the data, right? So we're going to say container dot nested container keyed by, we're going to pass in the same set of coding keys. For the specific key though, snippet. So what this is going to do is it's going to look for the snippet key, and it's going to grab that container, right, for the snippet key. And it's going to assign this block, sorry, not that block, this block right here. It's going to assign this block to, sorry, my mistake. It was this. It's going to assign this block to snippet container. So hopefully that's making sense. And maybe what I can do is to make it a little easier so that we can see both sides of the screen is do something like this. All right, so now that we have this snippet container, we can start grabbing some of the key value pairs that we need. Publish that, title, description, those three are really easy to grab. So why don't we say parse the title, parse the description, and parse the publish date. Okay, so in here we're going to say snippet container dot decode, and so we can actually start to decode a key value pair. We're going to decode, these are string values, right? So we're going to decode a string type. We're going to say that it's going to be a string, and we're going to pass in the key that specifies that title. So that's going to be our title right here. And again, we're going to specify try, and then we're going to say let what we're going to assign it to this property up here. So we're going to say self.title is equal to, right, snippet container, and it's going to try to decode the value, which is of a string type, for the key title. Right, so it's going to try to grab this guy, right, for that key title, right? It's going to try to assign it to our title property. Okay, next for description. So self.description is equal to try snippet container.decode, and again, it's going to be string type, and it's going to string.self for the key description. Okay, and for this last one, self published equals here try snippet container dot decode. We're actually going to try to decode this. We could leave it as a string. You can see that here the publish date is a string, but we can actually try converting it to a date object on the spot. So we're going to say decode it into a okay, I'm just going to say date like that for the key published. Now the reason why we have an error here is because we've actually we've declared this published property as a string. So I'm actually just going to set this to a date instead, right, so that we can actually assign a date type into it. And it's actually better to work with the date than a date string if you're going to have to do any sort of date manipulation. All right, so the next thing we want to do is let's tackle the thumbnails next in here. So let's say parse thumbnails. So from here, from this container, how do we get into the thumbnails container? Well, we have to get the thumbnails nested container. So the way we do that is we're going to declare another constant here. Let's call it thumbnail container equals try, and this is in the snippet container, right? So snippet container dot nested container, we're going to pass in coding keys for the key thumbnails, right? Because that's the key right here, and that's going to give us this container or JSON object. Okay, so we're one step closer. So now we have this container in here. Now, how do we get to the URL key? Well, we need to actually get this nested container or JSON object first, keyed by the high key. So let's just drill down even further. Let high container equals try thumbnail container. Right, so we're going from the thumbnail container to a deeper nested container. Again, coding keys.self for the key high. And that's going to give us this container. Finally, we have access to these key value pairs. And in here, we can say a self.thumbnail is equal to high container dot decode string type, right? String type, string.self for the key, for the key thumbnail, which is actually mapped to the JSON key URL. So that is going to grab this value right here, right? Keyed by URL, and it's going to assign it to our thumbnail property. So we also have to put try there. Lastly, let's parse the video ID. So what do we have to do? From the snippet container, right? This is the snippet container. We have to get this JSON object keyed by resource ID. So let's say let resource ID container equals try snippet container dot nested container keyed by coding keys dot self for the key resource ID. Right, so then that gives us this inside container containing this key value pair. We want this piece of data keyed by video ID. So finally here we can say self.video ID is equal to resource ID container dot decode string type, so string dot self for the key video ID. Did we not have that? Oh, there it is for video ID. All right, and oh, we have a try here. So that's all the code we need to write for the decoding instructions, but I did say I want to mention about why we have this coding key here, and that's because that allows us to pass these cases or these enum types into here when the parameter is asking for which key to decode and which key to grab the containers for. That's why we have to specify that this enum conforms to the coding key. So hopefully that makes sense. I'm sure it's a little bit confusing if this is the first time you're watching it. I would advise you just to watch this little part where we're writing these instructions a couple of times until it starts to sink in, or you can wait until the next app we build that we need to parse JSON, because we're going to need to do this for a lot of the apps that work with APIs, right? And all of them the JSON responses will be a little different, and so the instructions will be a little different, but the technique is the same. All right, so that was much of the heavy lifting. What we've done right now is we've described how to parse one of these JSON objects into an instance of our video object here. But what we're missing still is that when we get the JSON response back from the YouTube Data API, we actually get this whole JSON object here. So we have to also provide instructions on how to parse this guy. But this part is very simple because the only key we're interested in is this key right here, which contains the array of these JSON objects that we want to parse. So let's go back into our Xcode project right now, and I'll show you how to, we're going to wrap this up in no time. So let's create a new Swift struct. We'll add a Swift file, and we're going to call this response. And this is going to be a struct called response, and it's going to conform to the Decodable Protocol, right? And it's going to have a property called items, which is an array of video objects, okay? Now we're going to make this property optional, so it's going to be nil at first. The next thing we have to do, as you remember, is specify the coding keys enum, and it's going to be string encoding key here. And in here we specify a case with the key or keys that we are interested in. So if we take a look at this being the response, the only key we're interested in at this point right now is items. Right, so I'm just going to specify items here, and it also matches our property name here, so I'm not going to need to do the equals string. Okay, and then we're gonna do the init here, and again, autocomplete's working against me, so I'm gonna just type it out like that. And in here, we're gonna specify the instructions on how to parse the items here. Now these instructions are very simple. First, let's get the container. So let container equals decoder dot, don't forget the try keyword, decoder dot container, right, keyed by coding keys dot self. And that's going to give us this container right here. And we already have access to the items key. Right? That's going to be simple. So all we do right here is we do self.items is equal to container.decode. And we're not going to find the type that we need here because the type is basically an array of video objects. And that's what we want to convert it to. So when we write decode here, we're just going to pick anyone. But for the type, we're going to specify that it is an array of video objects, right? These guys right here. All right, so for the coding key, dot items, and that's basically it. And we have to specify try up here. Oh, and also specify, you use this dot self to indicate that this is a type that you want. This is what you want to try to decode this JSON right here into this type, an array of video objects. So that's all we have to do. Now we can go back to our model. Let's finish off our implementation here. So here we have parsing the data into video objects. The first thing we need to do is declare a new JSON decoder object, or create a new JSON decoder. All right, the other thing we're going to do before we actually run the parser or run the decoder is we have to set the date decoding strategy. And you're essentially specifying the date type when you convert string data, as in the JSON data right here. For example, this date right here, you're specifying the date format so it knows how to convert that string date into an actual date object. So this date format is actually a standard format called ISO 8601. So that matches this standard right here. So it's going to be really easy. Okay, so now that we've told the decoder that if you find dates in the JSON, it's going to be of that format, we can actually run the decoding method now. So we're going to say decoder.decode. Right here, you can you specify what type you want to try to change this JSON data into, and we do have that. It's going to be of the type response, right? And what the JSON data, what is that? That's going to be the data right here. Data. And we've already checked that it's not nil, so we can actually force unwrap that. So that method is going to decode the JSON data. Let's assign the result to something. So we're going to say let response equals, and because this method throws, we're going to have to just wrap it in some error handling. So we're going to try to do this, and we're going to catch any errors that may occur. So we're going to put this inside the do block. So if this method fails, if something goes wrong with the parsing, it's going to throw an error, and it's going to be caught down here. So this is, if this is the first time you've seen any sort of error handling in Swift, in general, how it works is if there is a method call or something that you're doing that may throw an error, you have to put the try keyword in front of it, and you have to wrap that inside a do block. And then you have to have a corresponding catch block, or you should. And this is where you handle the error if it gets thrown. All right, so we're done. So let's just try this out. I'm going to use the dump keyword to just output everything inside response into the console so we can see if this works or not. So let's put a breakpoint right here, and let's just run the application. This is going to hit the YouTube API. It's going to get the JSON response, and it's going to try to decode it. So let me actually just put a breakpoint right here. I'm going to put a breakpoint right here, and I'm also going to put a breakpoint right here, and I'm going to put a breakpoint right here inside all of the decoding instructions. So it's still launching the simulator. And when our app finally runs, we should basically see it come into here first, right? Where it's trying to decode it into our response object. And then, yeah, so there we go. It's hit this breakpoint. It's going to try to decode this entire JSON response that I've highlighted here. It's going to try to decode it into an instance of the response object. So I'm going to hit this to let it run. And as expected, it's come into our decoding instructions for the response. So inside here, we've basically given it instructions to decode the value for the items key, right? Try to decode that into an array of video objects. So essentially, try to decode this, right, into an array of video objects. So if I hit continue execution, now it's come into our first video, right? It's coming into the first JSON object, this guy right here, and it's going to try to then go through our instructions and output a video object. So I'm going to continue execution, and it's done that. So now it's come back for the second JSON object, this guy right here. Now it's going to go through the decoding instructions, and now this is the third one. So now we're at this point, right? So it's going to go through these instructions for each one. There are 5. Okay, so now we're done. We've parsed all 5 of these JSON objects into video objects, and when I dump the response, we should see the results. So I'm going to execute that, and there it goes. Let me just pull this up so you can see. I scroll all the way up. It's a lot of data, but you can see that there's the response object. It's got a property called items, and inside you can see a list of videos. You know, it's all of our stuff. 5 elements, and each of these are videos. I can't actually collapse these right here, but nothing's crashed. Everything should be good. You know, another way we can test this is, you know, just do some debugging or some outputting in the console, so we can remove some of these breakpoints. Let's just deactivate the breakpoints and run our app again. And right before it dumps the response, we can check what's in the response, right? Items, access the first, we can access the first video. So you can see it's got all the data, right? This is the second video, and we can actually access the title or description, video ID. So everything seems to be there. Everything seems to be working. And yeah, that was a lot of work, but after you've done it a few times, parsing this JSON becomes a lot easier. Now, before we end off, let's go ahead and deactivate our breakpoints right here, and let's check in our code. But this time, I'm actually going to remove my API key first. So let me go into my constants file, and let me just delete this key and save it. And then let's bring up terminal, and let's do git status. And we added a new file, so we actually have to add this file to our commit. So I'm going to say git add, let's write git status again, and now we can see all of the files that we modified. Let's do git commit added code to parse the JSON response. Okay, let's commit that. And then now we only have to push it to our repository. And so it's sending it. We go back to GitHub and we refresh that. We have our latest commit, and Bitrise should pick that up. If I refresh the page, you can see there, and it's going to pull the code from GitHub, our latest commit, and it's going to compile it and make sure nothing's broken, and we should be good to go. Alright, so today you successfully turned the JSON from the YouTube API into an array of video objects that you can use in your app. Now I want to turn it over to you. Were you able to follow the JSON parsing and understand what was happening? Even if the syntax parts don't quite make sense to you, were you able to kind of follow the nested structure and how we were reaching the different key value pairs that we needed by traversing that sort of JSON hierarchy? Let me know by leaving a quick comment below. In the next lesson, we're going to work on the user interface and display some of those video objects into a table view. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you don't miss it, and also give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. And one last thing, if you want to grab the source code for the project, just visit the GitHub page that I checked the code into. The link will be in the description below. Alright, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next lesson.